Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tonellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I have made it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. This episode is brought to you by Hachette Australia. For those listening in today and who may not know, the Richell Prize is a prestigious Australian literary prize presented in partnership with the Emerging Writers Festival and Hachette Australia, awarded each year to an unpublished writer. The prize was established in memory of Hachette CEO Matt Richell, who died in a tragic accident in 2014. Now, many writers who've won or been shortlisted have gone on to be published by Hachette Australia. Back in 2021, for those who have been with me for that long, I was privileged to interview the 2018 winner, Ruth McIver, about her thrilling novel, I Shot the Devil. And today, I have the honour of talking to the 2023 winner of the Richell Prize, Alex Sawyer. Alex is a psychologist, a volunteer firefighter, a father, short story writer, and now a published novelist. Alex's award-winning novel, Rat Daniels, was published at the end of June, and I have to tell you, listeners, the book is unforgettable. A beautifully written, thoughtful and heartfelt coming-of-age story about friendship and loyalty that will stay with you long after you've finished reading. And on that note, let me say congratulations, Alex, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Alex, I wondered if you could take me back to your decision to enter the Richell Prize back in 2023 and where you were at with this story. How long had you been working on it and what tipped you in the direction of entering?
2023, the Richell closes to entries in July, and I think I would have been working on the book for about 18 months at that point. It was maybe 50% of the way through the first draft, but certainly not very polished. And I went into the Richell Prize very confident that I was going to get absolutely nowhere with it. And it was more about having the opportunity of a deadline to really not just focus on those first few chapters and polishing them and getting them to a good standard and having an excuse to put it in front of my mum and say, hey, what do you think of this? Where do you reckon the commas should go? But also the actual process of the Richell Prize, you need a synopsis, you need a chapter by chapter breakdown. So all of that felt like a good opportunity to have another perspective on the book. So it wasn't really with any hopes of getting anywhere with it. It was much more about, here's an opportunity to really think about what I want the whole of this novel to be and to actually kind of kick my butt into gear a little bit. And yeah, everything that kind of came after that was gravy.
Fantastic. So it wasn't a complete novel at the stage that you entered the Richell Prize. And that, I think, is the attraction of entering in many ways, because you actually don't need to have finished a novel to enter. It is, as you say, I think you have to enter the first 3 chapters or the first 20,000 words. And then, as you say, the synopsis and the chapter breakdown. So you were about 50% of the way through, you said.
That would be my guess. I'd need to go back and have a look. It's very hard to tell once you're, 10 edits into a project what it looked like in the first draft, because there's so much that gets cut out along the way. I certainly didn't feel like I knew where all of the different plot threads were going at that point, but I remember I felt like, okay, I'm right at the point where usually I would want to give up because it's getting tough. So that's about the halfway mark.
Yeah, fair enough. So I think it's worth mentioning to listeners that you were no stranger to writing awards at that point. You'd had success with a few things. But I wondered then if you could tell me about that call, Alex. When did it happen and what was that all about? Where were you at?
I have a very distinct memory here because I was standing over a kitty litter bowl at the time, trying to plan it out one-handed while Vanessa Radnich from Hachette gave me the call to let me know that I'd won the Richell. And I couldn't believe it. I genuinely, I saw her name come up on the phone and I thought, okay, here's the gentle letdown. It's way too early to be announcing a winner. But no, she told me that I'd won, and Vanessa is just such an incredibly warm and enthusiastic person. So I think I was just riding on her warmth and enthusiasm while not really believing it entirely at the time, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But no, it was true. And the kitty litter got cleaned out. And yeah, I got on with the next steps of finishing the book pretty quickly after that.
So talking about next steps. So as the winner, you're offered a cash prize and a year-long mentorship with Hachette. So how did that all work? Did you have to finish the draft and then they would start working on it with you?
Vanessa kind of took me into the mentorship pretty much straight away from after the Richell Prize was announced. She'd obviously already seen those early chapters and then she wanted to see however much else I'd done at that point. Then it was very much ongoing conversations just about the book itself, but also what I wanted out of the experience of being a published author, where I saw that going for me. I'm trying to not use words like journey, but that's really ultimately what the conversation is about. Where do you want the journey to take you? And then a bit further down the track, once I had that first draft finished, those more in-depth conversations about structure and plot and character and things like that. And then at the end of the mentorship, we saw where the book was at, and yeah, Hachette offered me a contract, and we went from there.
Fantastic. So, fast forward to publication. How different was the novel that you began or that you were working on to the finished product?
I think ultimately everything was there from the beginning in terms of the two main characters and their relationship and where that relationship starts and where that ends, which is really sort of the heart of the story. But then there are a whole lot of other questions and other characters around that central relationship, which changed a lot over the course of writing. And that came both through the editing process, but also through just the fact that at this point I'd been writing it for about 4 years. And so your perspective on all of these things changes. Your perspective on the characters, your perspective on the world that they live in changes. And so I think that naturally went into the book as I thought more about it.
Let's talk about the book. Rat Daniels is a book, as I mentioned, a coming of age story about friendship and centers in large part on this friendship between the two boys, James Jimmy Quinn and Damien Daniels, whom Jimmy quickly dubs as Rat. So, Alex, tell me, where did the inspiration for this story come from?
So I had been probably thinking about a few different questions for about a year before I kind of had that moment of inspiration. And I have a very clear memory of when it happened, but the actual kind of, I guess, topics that the book's about had been on my mind for longer than that. The previous summer, there'd been a pretty significant bushfire in the area that someone had been arrested for. So it was very clearly a case of arson, and it was done on essentially what was going to be the worst fire danger day of the year. And it got out of hand pretty quickly. Luckily, no one died in that fire, but certainly there was some property destruction and a lot of loss of kind of the natural environment. And it had just sort of stuck with me that year more so than maybe some other fires, because the question just goes through your mind every now and then. What is in someone's heart? What's in someone's thoughts when they do something like that? So that had been just kind of in the back of my mind, percolating away. And at the same time, I think just because of the nature of my work, I work with a lot of young men. I'm kind of constantly always thinking about the nature of friendships between young men. And I think I'd been thinking a lot that year about how those friendships change over the course of childhood, how they're formed, how they're broken, how they're reformed. And yeah, those kind of questions all sort of collided in my brain at one point on a really nice November day. And sort of immediately, the characters of Jimmy Quinn and Rat Daniels popped into my head. And Rat being in prison, having been arrested for a crime that he said he'd never committed, and Jimmy being interviewed by the police and just wondering to himself what he really believes and how well he knows his best mate.
Now, the story is told entirely from Jimmy's point of view. And while it is clear that the boys have very different family and home lives, their bond is irrefutable. But as is so often with these types of stories, Alex, stories that draw on childhood memories, we as readers get the distinct sense that not all of Jimmy's memories are reliable. So tell me about this as a narrative tool and why was this important to the story?
It was probably one of the hardest things for me to write was, being a middle-aged man, putting myself in the mind of a 19-year-old who's trying to put himself in his own mind at, say, age 7 or age 12. And so there's all these layers of assumptions about what might be going through a person's mind in that point. And you even make assumptions about your own childhood filtered through the lens of where you are at your current point in life and looking at things and realizing different things or maybe having different biases that you didn't have when you were a child. And so all of that was just difficult and therefore a lot of fun to try and write through. And it meant that I could talk about the nature of crime without it feeling to the reader necessarily that it was going to be a procedural. Because I think if you went in expecting a procedural, you'd be very disappointed by where the story goes and a lot of the doubt and uncertainty around it. But if you are centered really in this one person's perspective, we all know what it's like to see someone that we care about be accused of something and hear so many different versions of events from different people and be in that state of confusion and wanting to believe, but also doubting and then wondering why we doubt and what it says about us that we do doubt. And that was what I wanted to create for Jimmy as a narrator so that the readers, I think, could also experience that, but then judge how he responds to that.
Yeah, judging how he responds to that. Is Jimmy protecting himself, or do you think this was more about Rat protecting Jimmy?
I think they're protecting each other. I think they're protecting themselves. I think they're protecting, certainly for Jimmy, he's a lot of the time protecting an idea that he has about this friendship and what this friendship means. And again, I find really relatable. I think we do that a lot in terms of our relationships with others. We want them to look a certain way because if they don't look that way, what does that say about us and the type of person that we are? And it's so easy to justify our own actions and contextualize our own actions. And it's so easy to look at the actions of others and say, well, no, this is just part of the nature of who they are. And it's very cut and dry and it's very black and white. I don't have a great answer to it because I'm always thinking about it and I'm always changing my mind about where someone's at, including, characters that I've written about and should really know.
In terms of being in Jimmy's head, I found it hard not to feel a little bit frustrated with him at times. You know, his inability to confront what I thought were obvious signs that Rat was in trouble, or his inability to articulate, feelings about what he saw or what he suspected might have been going on, or even to deal with his own difficult emotions, which kind of led me to think about what was going on in Jimmy's own life and how this impacted his own feelings of self-worth. Because, even at the beginning of the book, he believes he's a pretty shit person, someone who's morally weak. He thinks this, and yet he seems unable to change it. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, look, I really love hearing you say that because that's certainly how I feel about him. And I think it's always tricky to read a character who is frustrating you. But, so much of the book is about the nature of young men and how they grow up. And that's such a important part of the experience, not just for young men, but I think all teenagers have that experience of seeing who they want to be and constantly frustrating themselves and wondering why they can't be that person or wondering if it's worth the effort of trying to be that person. So I didn't want to make that journey too easy for Jimmy, but I also wanted at the very least for a reader to see why he had become that type of person or why he had come to some of those choices, which, as you say, they're fairly passive choices a lot of the time. And then towards the end of the book, maybe see where those choices have taken him and where he now is as legally an adult. Whether or not he feels like an adult, but legally he's an adult and he's going to go out into the world and he's going to be a person in the world. So you kind of want to see as someone who's invested in a character that they are learning from their experiences. Whether or not those behaviors are going to be easy to change, we don't know.
And I guess that leads me to ask you, Alex, how much of your work as a psychologist helped you get inside Jimmy's head?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's something I'm always very cautious to talk about. Obviously, you're very privileged as a psychologist that you get to hear people's stories in great detail and get to talk to people about some of the most vulnerable experiences of their lives. And you always have to be incredibly respectful of that. And I would never think of those or want to think of those stories ever in a million years as, fodder for fiction or for anecdotes, even anonymously. So nothing that I've ever done in my work will ever go into my fiction. But the nature of the work, you have to be, sometimes say you have to be relentlessly curious to be a psychologist. You can never take anything at face value and you can never hear a statement and not think to yourself, we can go a little bit deeper with this, which can be very annoying sometimes when you're talking to a psychologist, but it's the nature of the job. And so that is always there, I think, in my writing, is that desire to understand why we do the things that we do and why so much of what we do maybe contradicts who we want to be or what our instincts are in a particular moment.
I was also particularly interested in your exploration of the private and public school divide, for want of a better phrase, which I thought you
Mhm.
dealt with or that you wrote about with particular insight in this book. And it's not something that you often see in novels, but this was definitely, I think it definitely affected the dynamics between Rat and Jimmy, and especially when the other kids, Mo, Samira, and Meg, join their friendship circle. There are things that Jimmy learns about Rat from the other kids, which he never really kind of put together before.
I think it's a very Australian sort of class divide, the private public school divide. You don't see it in a lot of other countries. And it's one that I find really interesting. I've been to school in both systems as a student, and I've worked in both systems as a psychologist. So I've got a fair bit of exposure to public schools and private schools, and they do sort of feel like different worlds, particularly when you're a young person. And then you see, most people, they'll go off into the workforce or into university and see that there's really no difference between people who went to public or private school. But the experiences of what school is like can be really, really different. So I wanted to capture some of how those experiences can be different, but also how much for a certain type of young person, not everyone, but for a certain type of young person, it's very easy to identify with that as, well, this is part of who I am and this is how I see myself. And, there's a little bit of an us and them mentality that can come into it that goes both ways. And then through Jimmy, you had this character who maybe has this little bit of a chip on his shoulder where he feels like he's a bit too much of a bogan for the private school system, but he's a little bit too posh for hanging out with, or a little bit too naive maybe to be hanging out with the public school kids. And so he's feeling stuck between those two worlds.
I think it contributes in large part to the loneliness that draws him to Rat in the first place.
Oh, absolutely. And also just at that point in his life, having been to so many different schools, by the time that he was 7 years old, just not really feeling a sense of connection anywhere in particular. And then meeting this boy who has such a strong sense of connection to the place where he lives. And I think just instinctively, Jimmy's drawn to that.
It's clear that Jimmy loves Rat, and despite his inability to understand everything about his friend and the secrets that threaten to tear them apart, I believe the bond remains very strong. And I think you've explored the nuances of this kind of friendship so beautifully, because these kinds of friendships, whether it be childhood or teenage friendships, can be so fraught, and they don't usually survive the angst and hormonal charge of teenage years, do they?
No, not a lot of the time. I mean, it's just adolescence is such a period of massive change, and so many of our friendships at that time can be friendships of maybe convenience or proximity. And then as we change and sort of discover a little bit more about who we are and who we want to be, sometimes those friendships can shift. Not for everyone. I got to admit, like I'm a 40-year-old man who's still catching up every weekend with the guys I met in high school. But for a lot of us, we do sort of lose those friendships, not necessarily as dramatically as some of the friendships in the book, but sometimes it's just drifting apart.
Exactly. It's more about circumstances and common interests and things that just don't apply anymore
Mm.
when you're no longer in the same vicinity of each other every day.
Yeah, and this was very much not that relationship, the one between Jimmy and Rat. I wanted there to be that level of intensity and intimacy in it. I joked sometimes with the publishers about just sell it as a love story. It's a love story between two blokes who are just best mates in the world, and it's going to lead them to terrible places sometimes, but that's how they feel about each other.
And talking about leading them into some dark places at times, there are some deep seated secrets at the heart of this book. And I wondered if you thought friendships like the one that Jimmy and Rat enjoy, can they survive withholding deep secrets?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think they can survive, but they are always going to be wounded by those secrets. And it's a tragedy for any relationship, but I think particularly the friendships between men, the inability sometimes to communicate beyond not just the superficial, but also just the practical. That's sort of where a lot of the relationships and friendships can park themselves. And then if there is these secrets, if there are these things that someone's really struggling with and they can't talk about them, it festers. And that is absolutely a wound in a relationship. One that I think friendships can survive, but they're always much, much healthier if that wound is dealt with.
I can't help but think that Jimmy might have been a little bit different had he known what was in Rat's head. I think things would have been a lot different for them.
Yeah. But don't we always think that about people we know when we find out something about them and we just, I would have behaved so differently if I'd known. And there's almost that impulse sometimes that you have to resist to say, why didn't you tell me? And the reason is always, shame or guilt or uncertainty about how people will respond. I think one of the beautiful things about their friendship, for all the flaws that it has, is you do believe that it would be unconditional between the two of them. Whatever the truth is, there's going to be that unconditional love, for better or worse.
Yeah, I agree, for better or for worse. Now, one of the things that bonds Jimmy and Rat over the course of their childhood and adolescence is their love of nature. And I think through this common passion, we learn more about Rat in particular. And I think we get to understand a little bit more the complexity of his personality. Was that important to you?
Yeah, it was really important to me. I think the earliest scenes that when you have that moment of inspiration and you're just frantically writing and everything really feels like it's flowing and it's beautiful, all of that was about those moments in nature when they were very young. And yeah, it's certainly not based in any of my experiences. I grew up on the plains of Adelaide. I was very suburban, but maybe a little bit more of now that I live in the hills and see my son and his mates and what they get up to on the weekends, probably seeing a little bit more of that and just the beauty of a child's relationship to nature and how just in a moment and in a space they can be where everything around them is of interest and everything around them is an opportunity to touch and to feel and to play in a way that I definitely feel like I've lost a bit of connection with. I love nature and I love being out in nature, but I don't have that same instinct that you see in a child to go, oh, I can be a part of this. I can play with this, or I can climb this, or I can roll through this.
I think we have the adult caution, don't touch that or leave that alone or come away from there. We lose our sense
Yeah,
of
100%.
curiosity. Yeah.
Or,
Yeah.
or even just in the back of your head going, I'm going to have to do the washing later today.
Yeah.
So it's all well and good to roll through the mud when you're not the one having to clean the pants afterwards.
Indeed, which I think leads me to my next point. I am a mother of three. They're all adults now. But it
Yep.
is it is hard to watch your children make mistakes, especially
Mhm.
when you do everything in your power to prevent them and you know that some mistakes could potentially have a huge cost to your child. And I think
Yeah.
Jimmy's parents are in the unenviable position of having to watch each of their children make some catastrophic mistakes. And, Jimmy in particular, at one point, I think they're left wondering where the hell they went wrong. Were the
hmm
mistakes that Jimmy made within the bounds of normal teenage rebellion, or do you think there was more to it? A cry for help, perhaps?
It's a great question. I think that cry for help can be part of the normal adolescent experience sometimes. I guess a big part of my job is just normalizing the fact that so many of us will go through times in our life where we do really struggle with that quiet desperation, or we do really struggle with that catastrophic mistake. And it doesn't mean that we're not normal, doesn't mean that we're not going to go on to live happy, successful, fulfilled lives. Just that adolescence can be really fraught. The hardest probably relationship in the book for me to write was the one between Jimmy and his mum, because you're seeing it through Jimmy's eyes, and Jimmy is at a point in his life where I don't think he understands his relationship with his mother, and I don't think he understands how he feels towards this person and why she made some of the decisions that she makes along the course of the book. And so you don't want to cheat and kind of wave a flag and say, look, this is what was really going on, but you do want it to be there, I guess, in between the lines for the reader to see that relationship is really difficult and mistakes got made, but at the same time, it's not unsalvageable. They've had difficult lives. They haven't had impossible lives. And certainly, I don't think it's outside of the bounds of a lot of what you see in the world in terms of adolescence and risk taking and mental illness and all of the things that we want to avoid for our children, but we can't always do that. We can't live their lives for them.
Yeah, so true. So well said, Alex. Now, talking about mums, your book is dedicated to your mum, which I found just beautiful. And you also mentioned earlier that you were passing drafts in front of your mum for comma placement. I'm sure she did more than that for you. Can you talk about that and why it was important for you to dedicate this book to your mum, if it's not too personal?
I'm happy to answer the question. Thank you for asking. It's a little tricky to talk about, but my mum passed during the writing of the book, and she was always a huge influence on my life, particularly in terms of, someone who loves books, who loves reading. My parents were always incredibly busy. They both either worked full-time or were studying full-time. Dad was a public servant. Mum was a speech pathologist in the hospital system, and she would still make time every weekend to do something with one of her children, and she would individualize it. It wasn't just we're all doing something together. She'd pick activities with each child. And for me, it was often we'd go to the library, we get a huge stack of books, and we go sit in the park, get something from the bakery, and just start reading through the books that we'd borrowed. And so when I did start writing, and I've written my whole life, but it was always very personal. It was always for me. I never wrote for anyone else. I very rarely shared my writing. And so it was a very specific choice that I made a few years back to actually start sharing my writing and try to get published. And it was just really natural for me to go to mum first and say, hey, what do you think about this? And I was always much more interested in what she thought about the characters and the relationships and the just, the tension in the story. But my mum was a perfectionist. So she'd always say, well, that stuff's good, but like you don't know how to use an apostrophe, which is probably true. Yeah, it was very easy to dedicate the book to mum, and I was really happy that even when she was quite unwell, it was after I'd won the Richell, and it was after we'd had those conversations, and she sort of knew that the book was going to get published, and she was very happy for me about that.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Alex. I'm sorry. I hoped it wasn't too personal for you, but that was beautiful. Thank you so much.
No, not at all. It meant a lot for me to be able to dedicate the book to her, and it means a lot to me to be able to talk about how much she meant to me and still does mean to me. Yeah, she was an amazing woman.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Okay, so Alex, you mentioned that you grew up in Adelaide, but you're now living in the Adelaide Hills, and the book is set in the fictional town of Eden Ridge, which I imagined was somewhere also in the hills, a small town which we
Mhm.
understand is slowly being sold off to corporate interests. Was the town based on a place that you know or an amalgamation of different places?
Yeah, it was very much an amalgamation. It's not anywhere specific in the hills. There's a lot of places with Eden in the name around the place, but it was more about wanting to capture, I guess, a particular sort of psychogeography of what it's like to live here. And I wanted the dams and the streams and the forests and the plantations to all feel real and all feel recognizable. But also, what I've learned since the book's come out is that they feel recognizable to a lot of places across Australia. And I have people come up to me and go, the pines where all the teenagers hang out and smoke and avoid their parents. They're like, oh, yeah, we had pines, where we grew up. It's like, yeah, there's pine plantations all over the place where kids were sneaking off to, clearly.
Well, I loved it. And I think your descriptions of the area and the landscape were so vivid. And I could see Jimmy and Rat roaming those hills and knowing all the streams and the trees.
There's not a single scene there that I can't picture in my mind as somewhere in the hills that I've been to, and I've sort of just all mashed them into one. Also, I just think that feeling that the hills often has of it is growing so much. I've only lived here for about a decade, but I've got friends who have lived in the hills their whole lives, and they'll talk so much about how much of that farmland and how much of that natural reserve is just disappearing and becoming urbanized because people have got to find somewhere to live. And I didn't necessarily want to condemn that because, again, people need somewhere to live. But I did want to explore that and what that looks like from a lot of different perspectives. Jimmy at the ripe old age of 19 has a lot of sort of rural nostalgia, but some of the adults in his lives, I think, are a little bit more pragmatic about what it means for people to need housing and for places to maybe lose a little bit of that character as they grow into more urbanised areas.
You talked earlier about a bushfire or, a case of arson that happened in advance of you beginning to write this novel. And there is a pretty catastrophic bushfire in Rat Daniels, which I'm sure your work as a volunteer firefighter gave you some insight about. And this one is also a suspected arson attack. In places like the Adelaide Hills, this must be a constant fear and something all residents are prepared for. Was this something you were particularly keen to explore in the book, or was it more just about responding to that event before you started writing?
I think it was the question in my mind with the two boys was really how do you respond when the person you love most in the world has been accused of something horrific and then just the setting of the hills and I guess some of my experience with bushfire, which to be honest, like very rarely is it arson. You know, even if it's deliberately lit, it's usually someone being stupid with an angle grinder or kids mucking about. Most of the time though, it's accidents and, you know, lightning strikes and things like that. But it's just always constant in your mind during summer, particularly around that time. We'd had Black Summer a couple of years earlier, and then we had a bad fire season following that. And so everyone is just on a sort of heightened alert in summer for those things. I think more that, so that was in my mind at that time of year, more so than necessarily it kind of appeared in the book, which was, I think, much more about, yeah, how do you deal with the aftermath of these events?
Okay, Alex. Well, winning the Richell Prize was clearly a milestone in your career as a novelist, but I wondered if there was something that you know about yourself now that you didn't know before you were published.
A great question. I think there was a big question in my mind about whether or not I could finish a book. I've always known I could write, but you're writing for yourself, which is a very different thing than writing for an audience. And the beauty of writing for yourself is as soon as it gets hard, as soon as it gets difficult, as soon as it stops being fun, you can chuck it away and move on to something that does kind of, fill that cup a little bit more. And it was always in the back of my head, like, do you have the grit for this? Do you actually have the capacity to persevere knowing that at some point you're going to hate what you're writing? You're going to hate this book. You're going to hate these characters. You're going to think it's never going to go anywhere. That's just a natural part of any, endurance sport, which writing a novel is. So that's the thing I know about myself now, is that I can finish a book, and I've got a lot of confidence that I can finish more from this point on. But I don't think I was 100% sure on that when I started, and a big part of wanting to do this was being able to prove that.
I love that answer. So honest and so, yeah, just so real. We can all start projects, but it's whether or not we can finish it, whether we've got the drive, enthusiasm, the staying power, even the talent. I think sometimes, do we have what it takes to get this finished? So I love that you know that about yourself now. And so talking about finishing projects, is there anything else in the pipeline for you?
Yeah, definitely. But as is my nature, there's always sort of 3 projects going on at once. That's one of the ways that I've found actually helps me to persevere with a writing project, is just sometimes you can take a break from it by working on one of the other projects where it's just at that point where it's a little bit easier. You're not having to ask some of the more difficult questions of yourself. But, inevitably you've got to come back to the table and actually confront those difficult questions and work through them. So, yeah, I'm working on a novel that's also set in South Australia, still very much kind of looking at some of the similar themes to what I looked at in Rat Daniels, to the extent that I know what a theme is at this point. But I think I've got my head around that now. And yeah, that's going really well. I'm really enjoying that. But also there's a couple of other books that I'm working on that are maybe, a little bit outside of that Australian contemporary fiction or literary fiction vein. And that's also a lot of fun to do. Like I've never really had to think in terms of genre or category until getting published. So I always just wrote whatever I wanted to write about, and I always read whatever I wanted to read about. And I think that's true for most readers, is that they're not going to confine themselves to a particular genre or a particular shelf in the bookshop. They just they want to read what they enjoy, and they want to read what's good. And I want to write what I enjoy writing about, but also sort of recognizing that, sometimes you just got to put your head down and actually finish the one project that you're on before you start a new one.
Yeah, tough call, but yeah, it's just the nature of the publishing business, isn't it?
I haven't worked out the secret to it yet.
I love that, Alex. It's wonderful. Okay, so you might know that there are a lot of aspiring writers who listen to this podcast. And so I wondered if you were put in a room with a bunch of aspiring writers who might be in the position that you were back in 2023, what would you say to them? What advice would you offer them?
Can I be honest with you? I've been asked this question and I am terrible at answering it. And I try and work out why I'm so bad at answering it. And I think part of it is that in the work that I do, you're almost always trying to avoid giving people advice, because you just want to learn more about them and work out what they need for themselves. And I think a lot of writing advice, people will ask me, like, when did you know that you were ready to enter the ritual? And I think the answer is different depending on what type of person you are. If you are the type of person who is too perfectionistic and too anxious about your writing and always wants it to be this kind of next step up before you're willing to take the plunge and submit, then you probably need to submit earlier. Whereas if you're the type of person, and I'm more this type of person, so I need to watch myself on it. But if you get overconfident, or if you just go, well, it won't matter, I'll just chuck it out and see what, the world, how the world responds to it, then you actually want to pull back a little bit, and you want to make sure you've done your due diligence and you've done your editing passes and you've shown it to other people and you've thought about what's not working and how you're going to fix those things. So it's like the right advice is completely different for different people. So I sort of think the best thing you can do is just like know yourself, and know the only way you can know yourself is just by being really curious about yourself as you approach the writing, and ask yourself, when this feels like it's not working, like how specific can I be about what's not working here? I don't believe in imposter syndrome, for example, because that's just doubt. And doubt's not a bad thing for a writer. A writer should be doubting all the time. But imposter syndrome is what we feel when that gets generalized way too far out. And instead of asking ourselves useful questions about, what's not working in this sentence? What's not feeling right about sharing this piece of work right now? We're asking ourselves big unhelpful questions like, am I a good person? Should I be even trying to write a book? What's the point of all of this? And that's where it stops being helpful. So I think the more you can sort of be curious about how you're feeling when you're writing, and understand when you're experiencing doubt or when you're experiencing hesitation, what that is actually about, the easier it is to answer those questions about, I think this is ready to share with the world. And once you're ready to share it with the world, then, only good things come from that. And I don't mean that in a Pollyanna-ish way. Like, you will get feedback and you will learn something from that feedback. It doesn't mean you need to take it on board. It doesn't mean you need to believe it as the be-all and end-all above your own opinions on the work, but you will know more. And that's never a bad thing, to know more. So that is my unhelpful, helpful advice.
Knowing more is never a bad thing, Alex. Thank you so much for sharing that. I love it. Now, on a final note, if you'd like readers to take away one thing from your novel, Rat Daniels, what would it be?
There's something you said earlier that a few people have said to me, and I think it's the most meaningful thing to hear, that it stayed with you. For me, that's where I wanted the book to end, is a place where you can kind of, I don't mind how people feel about the characters. I don't mind how people feel towards Rat and Jimmy. I think that's always going to be a personal experience of characters. But if you've written a character well, they're going to feel something towards them, and that's going to stick with them for a bit. And that was what I wanted to achieve with the book. So whenever someone tells me that, even when they're very annoyed with the characters, or even when they're, heartbroken for the characters, it stayed with them. And that means just the world to me.
Well, reading this book, this sublime book, was a total joy for me, Alex. I wish you every success, and I thank you for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
That's it for this episode, folks. Hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. If so, I'd love it if you'd leave a review on your preferred listening platform, which may include Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Amazon Music. Until next time, friends, happy reading.